Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 48. In this week's episode, I want to talk about inner child healing, what it is, why it's important, and some different things that we can do to heal our inner child. This past weekend, I took a trip with my husband and our two best friends to a place that I haven't been to in well over a decade, but it was somewhere that I went throughout my childhood, and being there as an adult, as a much more healed version of myself, was really wonderful. And it was healing to be in a place that I had such vivid memories of, but to be there as someone who is much more self-aware, who has developed a lot more emotional maturity. I think it made me feel so capable of handling any challenges or curveballs that were thrown our way over the course of the weekend. And I think one of the really wonderful things about revisiting memories or places that held meaning to you throughout your childhood as you're on your healing journey is that it allows you to reclaim some sort of power over the things in your life that are important to you. And so it feels very current, it feels very relevant for me, and so I want to share this with you. I think to one extent or another, everyone can take steps to heal their inner child. I don't necessarily think that you have to have been raised in an unhealthy environment to trace certain things back and to sort of accommodate a younger version of yourself in adulthood. But I do think that inner child work is especially important for those of us who are reparenting ourselves in adulthood. Because I think when you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you carry with you wounds from your childhood. And if those wounds are left untreated, they will fester. And I think one of the reasons that it is so important to treat these wounds in adulthood is because so many of them are centered around these really foundational aspects of our identity, of our personality, of our ability to show up in relationships and friendships. And so these different wounds sort of inform the way that we feel about ourselves, and in turn, the way that we feel about other people, and the way that other people feel about and perceive us. I think if we allow these wounds to fester, we will find ourselves as adults continuing to exist in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. We will constantly be feeling stressed. We will constantly be feeling triggered. And that can make simply existing feel so overwhelming. And so it is crucial to address these different wounds and to make an effort to actually treat them. One of the ways that I think you can tell that you might benefit from doing some inner child work is if you find yourself reacting to something in a way that is either disproportionate to your age or to the thing that you're reacting to. I think that is sort of a sign that whatever it is that you're feeling has much less to do with the present and much more to do with the past. Maybe a past version of yourself that was neglected, and recognizing that there is a younger version of yourself that is still existing within you that might be fueling these reactions is sort of the first step. When I first met my husband, before I knew anything really about mental health or the trauma that I had endured throughout my childhood, I was wildly insecure about my partner's past. And that's not because my partner's past was atypical. It wasn't like he did anything outrageous that would make the average person uncomfortable or anxious or insecure. But anytime someone from his life or an experience from his life that happened before me, that was present before we met, I would feel overcome with anxiety and stress and fear, I've come to realize. I had convinced myself that anything and anyone from my partner's life before we met was somehow better than our life now. And any time that he would think about these things or talk about these people, he would be reminded of a time in his life that was better than the present. And I was so fearful that those thoughts would lead to us no longer being together. I almost felt like when we met, I had put a veil over his eyes. And anytime he would talk about these things, there was the risk of that veil being lifted and him seeing me or our relationship or his life with me for what it truly was. And for whatever reason, I had convinced myself that that was somehow less than what his life was before. And so I would fight against these things. I would react with my emotions. There was no objectivity, and my emotions were not based in reality. They weren't based on anything that my husband and I had experienced in our relationship up until that point. But I was completely naive to the idea of an inner child. I had no idea what inner child healing was. And so the idea that a past version of myself that had endured trauma, that maybe had been abandoned or experienced some form of emotional neglect, was fueling these reactions in my adult life, in my adult relationship. I had no idea that I was projecting all of these different emotions onto a healthy partner and onto a safe, secure relationship. Meeting my husband, our relationship was really the first time that I was ever able to express how I was truly feeling. I think that was the first time that I ever felt safe enough to allow my true emotions to make their way to the surface and for me to express them in the best way that I knew how at the time. But looking back, there was so much that I didn't know, and I really would have benefited from understanding more about inner child healing. In the time since, I have read and researched about retroactive jealousy and its connection to OCD and OCD-like symptoms. I have read and researched a lot about insecure attachment and the different attachment styles, and how so often, so many of us who were raised by emotionally immature parents are sort of left with this sense that you can't rely on others to keep you safe or to be there for you. And so there's this consistent sort of underlying skepticism that's present that you apply to everyone and everything because you sort of existed for so long in a state of uncertainty. And so the idea that things can be calm and consistent is sort of foreign to you. I saw a post the other day that was talking about trauma responses and the idea that our trauma responses once kept us safe, and that as we start to heal, we should thank them and gently let them know that their job is done. It's time to grow. And I thought that that was really wonderful because a lot of what has helped me on the path to forgiving myself is learning how to validate my trauma responses and recognizing that there was a time in my life where I developed that skill or that coping mechanism, that particular behavior, because that's what I needed to do in order to survive, in order for me to secure the attention or the support of the person or people that I was dependent on. And I think visualizing a younger version of myself and understanding how stressful it must have been for her to exist in that kind of environment, it allows me to have so much more empathy for myself in those moments, because I don't think any child would choose to be hypervigilant. I don't think any child would choose to constantly be in a state of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. There are so many different situations that we find ourselves in throughout childhood when we're raised by an emotionally immature parent that we as adults would never want a little one in our lives to find themselves in. I would never want a young person in my life to feel unsafe around me, or to feel like I was a volatile and unpredictable presence in their life. So much so that they had to take on these unhealthy, sort of abnormal behaviors just in order to coexist with me. And understanding that that was the reality for so many of us, I think really allows us to forgive ourselves when our trauma responses are present in adulthood. But, and I cannot stress this enough, it is not justification to continue that unhealthy behavior. Once you've recognized it, you have to start to take steps to heal those things, both for yourself and for the other people in your life that you care about. If you do not, then you will be doing the same thing that the people who inflicted those wounds upon you have done. And that is what we're fighting against. We are breaking the cycle, and this is one of the many ways that we can do that. Something that I think can be really helpful when it comes to inner child work is when you find yourself in a situation, like we talked about earlier, where the emotions that you're feeling or your reaction is disproportionate to your age or the thing that you're reacting to, ask yourself, what age do I feel right now? Can you envision you at a different time throughout your life feeling this way? Maybe you found yourself in a lot of situations where you were feeling like this and you were never able to express it. And so you suppressed it. All of these emotions were sort of neglected. I think being able to pinpoint a time in your own personal history where maybe this wound was created or maybe this wound was agitated can help you to trace these things back and to make it make sense. Because I think understanding the origins of our triggers is one of the best ways to manage them in adulthood. I know I reference it a lot, but not only is my relationship with my husband something that I am so incredibly proud of and thankful for, but it has been and continues to be one of the greatest learning experiences of my life. I think in part, especially because of how I was raised throughout my childhood and the trauma that I endured surrounding relationships and communication, things that are crucial for developing any sort of real emotional connection with another person. And so early on in mine and my husband's relationship, part of what fueled my separation anxiety was fear. When you're raised by an emotionally immature parent, you will most likely experience some form of triangulation, which involves two people talking badly about another person behind that other person's back. And the difference, I think, when emotional immaturity or narcissism or narcissistic tendencies are a factor, is that this triangulation is intentionally manipulative. It might be employed to intentionally turn you against another person or turn another person against you. And being around that kind of behavior throughout childhood can be really damaging. And clearly, it's something that you can carry with you into adulthood. And so part of why I was so afraid to be away from my husband in the early stages of our relationship was because I was convinced that he and whoever he was with were talking badly about me behind my back, that maybe this other person was trying to convince him not to be with me anymore because I was a bad influence on him, or because he could do better, or because his life was better before we met. And so all of these intrusive thoughts would be flooding my mind and would be causing me so much anxiety. But I didn't know where it was coming from. I didn't know that it was something that I could control. And I definitely didn't know that this fear that I had developed was actually rooted in my childhood. My parent had turned me against my other parent. There was a very clear and obvious team dynamic as I was growing up. And so triangulation was something that I was incredibly familiar with, even though I didn't know the term to define the behavior. And I think witnessing a parent talking badly about another parent in such an intense and hurtful way led me to believe that my partner was doing the exact same thing. And so once I started to realize my trauma and understand more about inner child healing and healing in general, anytime something like this would come up, where maybe my husband was having a conversation with someone else and I wasn't present. Or maybe I left the room when we were hanging out in a group setting. If any sort of anxiety would make its way to the surface, I would be able to address it, and I would be able to pinpoint exactly where that feeling is coming from. I can ask myself, what age do I feel here? Where in my personal history was this an issue for me? And why is this coming up now? And I think having the awareness to ask yourself those questions and then taking it one step further and developing the tools to actually answer those questions is invaluable when it comes to healing unresolved childhood trauma, as is the realization that we as adults can accommodate ourselves in the ways that our younger selves needed, but that our parents were incapable of. You can set boundaries to prevent the different ways that you might have consistently neglected yourself throughout childhood. You can create an environment, a safe space where you can make mistakes. These are things that we can sort of take into our own hands and reclaim some sense of power and control, autonomy, truly, over our lives. Since I've become aware of inner child healing, I think one of the really interesting things about it is that it can make you feel so happy and so sad simultaneously. Taking the steps to become the adult in your life that you always needed, creating safe spaces and learning to forgive yourself and to treat yourself with patience and compassion promotes feelings of autonomy and independence and competence, which are all phenomenal. I think especially to start to embody these different feelings after being raised in an environment where it was preferable for you to doubt yourself, and it was preferable for you to fear your mistakes. I think inner child healing can also help you to welcome change and spontaneity and play back into your life or into your life for the first time. It's no secret that emotionally immature parents have a really difficult time navigating change. And I think sometimes spontaneity and silliness, those things can sort of pale in comparison to whatever it is that our parent is feeling. And so regardless of what we might want to do throughout childhood, that childhood innocence or bliss that so many people talk about experiencing can sort of fall by the wayside because it's not as important as making our parents happy. And so I think healing our inner child can sometimes include reintroducing or introducing spontaneity and play into our lives. Understanding that not everything has to be hard, not everything has to be serious, can really sort of lighten things up. And of course, it helps you to better understand and manage your triggers in adulthood. I think these are some of the things that I have discovered along my path of inner child healing that have made me feel really happy. But I do think it's important to acknowledge the sadness that can sometimes coexist alongside that happiness. Having endured trauma throughout childhood and having taken the steps to become an adult who is emotionally mature, who is self-aware and is capable of forgiveness and compromise and empathy, not only has it showed me that it's possible to heal, but I think it has also kind of shined a spotlight on just how bad it was. And I think there are times throughout our healing journey when we can really sort of gaslight ourselves and we can ask ourselves, was it really that bad? Was it me? Was there something that I could have done differently to prevent this from happening? And I think becoming this version of myself has really sort of allowed me in a very black and white way to ask myself, would you want your child to have the same childhood that you had? When you allow yourself time and space to really sit with those questions, it becomes very clear what was okay and what was not okay. I think sometimes coming to terms with the reality of our childhood can be very heavy. to understand that we actually did exist in that environment and that a lot of why we are the way that we are sort of stems from that. This is sort of a side note, but this was something that I was writing about the other night. I think sometimes the anger that can make its way to the surface when you do start to realize the reality of your childhood, I don't think that it's self-deprecating necessarily. I think sometimes the anger is representative of the self-love that we have developed for ourselves because we have come to understand that we deserved better. One of the last things that I want to mention is something that I've experienced personally, and I'm sure that it is not a solitary experience. I'm sure this is something that other people have experienced also, but I don't think it's something that I've spoken at length about. Sometimes when you're taking steps to heal your inner child, despite the behavior that you grew up around, despite the reading and research that you have done to understand just how unhealthy it was and to feel justified in your decision to distance yourself or go no or low contact because boundaries, because no more people pleasing, all of these very real things. I think despite all of that, you can still have moments where you want your parents. And this past weekend brought some of those emotions to the surface for me. There were moments where I saw parents interacting with their children, observing them in a place where I last was as a child myself, made me sad because it made me feel like I wish I could experience this again with my parents in a healthy way. The last time I was there, I was naive to it all. Now, having seen it all for what it truly is, the only way that we would be able to recreate that childhood memory or to experience that again together in a healthy way would be for both of us to make a commitment to do the work. And what's so challenging about this is that we are not in control of our parents' decisions. I know I sometimes still feel like I just want to experience and feel unconditional love from the two people who have known me my entire life, from the two people who I have known my entire life. And there's nothing that I can do to make that my reality. And I think that that can be a really difficult thing to come to terms with as we get older. And I think it's something that can sort of make its way to the surface as we revisit these past experiences or these past memories. And so I think something to be aware of as we take steps to heal our inner child, specifically if we are revisiting memories or experiences that in the past we have shared with our parents, that it might make it very clear just how much things have changed. Immersing yourself in a particular environment, maybe one that you haven't been in for a long time, whether it's sights or sounds or smells, it might make these memories feel very real for you. And so there is a chance that there could be sort of a juxtaposition between how you're experiencing it now versus how you experienced it the last time. And I do think there can be sort of an added layer of complexity when you're exposing yourself to these different kinds of environments or experiences where you might see happy parents and happy kids interacting with each other. You're sort of getting a glimpse maybe back into that childhood innocence that you might have once experienced. And that can be painful. That can be really challenging to sit with. But it's not enough to get in the way of you taking steps to do the inner child work, because it is so important. And because the pain or the sadness or the grief that you might be sitting with has its home in the past, in relationships and experiences from your past that you're dealing with in the present. And healing those parts of yourself will make your future that much better and that much brighter. And that is why it's so important. And so there are a few things that I have started to do along my healing journey to prioritize healing my inner child. And the first, which is something that we talked about earlier, is recognition, understanding that there is a younger version of yourself that still exists within you. Once you recognize that, you can start to reflect on the different things that little you needed but were denied throughout your childhood. And you can create a space where all of those different things are accommodated so that you can live a life that is much more comfortable, that is much more aligned with who you truly are. Something else that you can do, which is sort of reminiscent of this trip that I took this past weekend, is revisit old memories and create new traditions. While this can be painful and it might bring to the surface feelings of anger, sadness, grief, or resentment even, I do think that it allows you to regain some form of power over your own life. Just because the people in your life that you experienced these sentimental moments with, that you created these meaningful family traditions with, are no longer a part of your life, that doesn't mean that those traditions can no longer be a part of your life either. These things are allowed to retain meaning, even without the people who are tied to them. And you are allowed to modify them and adjust them to better suit your life now and to carry them with you into your life moving forward. You can redefine the experience and how you feel about it. And in time, this thing can once again become a happy and positive memory. And lastly, one of the things that I think that we can do to really help us get in touch with our inner child is to create some sort of a dialogue. And you can do this internally. You can have sort of an internal conversation between your adult self and your younger self, especially if you find yourself in a situation where you are being triggered, where those emotions are rooted in a particular experience from your childhood. You can sort of parent yourself in the way that you needed at that time in your life now, as an adult. And I think showing yourself that kindness or that compassion or that empathy can help that child to feel safe. And I think in turn, that can help to calm our adult selves. But if you want to take this one step further and make it more of a physical representation of this conversation, you can write your younger self a letter. And this can be a very general letter about the way that you're feeling or where you're at in your life now. Or if you're dealing with a particularly stressful emotion or situation and you're trying to better understand where it's coming from or the things that you can do to feel okay about it, maybe zero in on that time in your life and address that specific version of yourself. So much of healing, I think, is about developing a deeper understanding of not only who we are, but also who we were. And inner child healing is an integral part of that. And so I invite you to recognize the little you within yourself. And I encourage you to really listen to what they need. And I hope that in doing so, that brings some positivity or clarity to your life as an adult. With that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to like our video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I'll be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast.